Okay, happy Thursday morning. Took me a while there to catch the what day we're at. So it's the Thursday morning of the first week of our course. And as I shared with you in the class and in the announcements, I offer these live online meetings as an optional thing that if you have any questions about some of the material that we covered during the week, or you're stuck with any of the assignments, or there's something else that I can do, these sessions are here really for me to help you with whatever you feel that you need help with. So I have moved away from having a very formal structure for these, and these days they are more of a as needed and kind of adapting with the needs of whoever is attending. And like I shared in the class, I offer these meetings for all of my two groups that I meet on Chandler Gilbert Pecos campus. So you might recognize some names or some faces or voices if the participants speak that you don't necessarily pick from your class. So they might be peers in another class, but regardless, they're studying the same material at the same pace as the rest of the group. So just to explain if that happens. And like I said, I offer these sessions once a week on Thursdays, both at the morning at 10 o'clock and then in the evening at 8 o'clock for about an hour. I have some other commitments where I need to go, especially after this morning meeting, so I rarely run it much further, but if needed, I try to find the time that we get everything addressed that possibly could be asked. One more thing that I probably should share regarding these is that I also record these sessions. So recording of these will be made available for you. Usually I try to do it within 24 hours after the sessions. Usually I'm quicker than that, but that's what I try to keep as a goal, that it is available for you. And like I shared in the class, with the very few exceptions, it is the Thursdays when we have these meetings. You will see on the calendar on your Canvas course that there are occasional times when I cannot do this meeting on Thursdays because of some of the other commitments that I have in place. And if that's the case, you'll notice that there's no link, there's no description for this meeting on that week's Thursday, and instead the meeting has been scheduled for Friday. And usually if I schedule it on Friday, I only do it in the morning at 10 o'clock. So again, that session would be recorded and you would have the help available. So I just want to offer them as an optional thing. Remember, this is not required. I do not expect that you have to attend. If you miss the weekly session in person, or if you're from my other class where we meet actually twice a week, if you miss both of them, this might be a good chance for you to make that attendance. So I just try to offer multiple chances and multiple ways to make that attendance requirement. Really, the most important thing, though, I would say, is that you get your assignments in every week. So I'm just going to stop sharing this screen and open another screen that is going to be important for us. And you should be seeing another screen which lists all of the assignments that we have for this week. So this week, I'm asking you to do 5 different pieces of assignments. The syllabus quiz, which is really straightforward. It simply questions, should you be cheating in an exam or not? that kind of stuff. And the answer should be very obvious, but it is one level of checks just to make sure that everyone knows what the expectations are. Then I'm asking you to complete icebreaker activity, which during the class yesterday, you heard quite a bit about what I've done, how my path took me here to the class with you. But since we're going to be spending all that time together, I'd really like to know a little bit about you. I'd like to know about your goals so I can be here to help you to meet those. So that's the second activity that I'm asking you to do. The third activity and fourth activity actually relate to the chapter material, which is the endocrine chapter that we're completing this week. And a quiz is like any quiz that you would expect. It covers the material from the textbook. And in terms of the quiz, students often feel that, oh my gosh, I should know all this from the top of my head. That's not the case. The quiz is part of the learning process. So while you're completing the quiz, there is always an option. If a question comes up that you're a little uncertain, there's a button there that you click and it will take you to the textbook. And I think it will even highlight that part of the textbook where an answer to that question is addressed. So as you work through the quiz, you actually learn the material as well. So take that as a chance and as a process during which you're doing the learning as well. So that's why there's quite a few points available from the quiz. It's an important part. The fourth element of our course material for this week that I'm asking you to complete is the practice anatomy. So this week it's about structures, anatomy of the structures that relate to the endocrine system. Again, very straightforward. There is a little video that might be helpful where my colleague, Dr. Greer, goes through them one by one, showing you that, hey, this is that structure and this is what it looks like. When you have watched that video, all of those structures that were covered on that, the questions on the practice anatomy activity are exactly from there. The reason why it's worthwhile to take the time to complete that practice anatomy is that when you complete your practical during the exam week, all of the questions on the practical are from those practice anatomy questions. So it really is kind of getting you set up for future. And at this point, I remind you again that you remember for the practicals, I'm going to be working with you in terms of that if you take really good notes during your practice anatomy activities, you can use those notes to guide you during the practical tests. And the final fifth piece of assignment that you have to complete for this week is the lab on endocrine disruptors. We completed that yesterday in the class. So if you attended to the class, you should have all the answers to all of those questions on that lab activity and lab report. And I really strongly encourage you that you try to make sure that you get it uploaded when you're ready. It's easy to do activities and forget to submit them in. And you normally at the end of the semester, I get a bunch of students sending that, oh, here's all my labs. I forgot to submit them in. That might work. Sometimes it might not. It depends how much time I have on my hands. You really should be uploading them to where I ask you to upload them. So all of these 5 pieces of homework for this week are due at the end of the week. So at the end of the Sunday, I believe it's 1 minute before midnight. So if you can try to make that deadline, that would be most helpful. Even though I am usually quite flexible, if something happens to you and you just message me, especially if you do it before the deadline, I will try to work with you to find that you have enough time if an extension is needed or so on to get those in. However, having said that, Even though I'm super flexible, the software that we use isn't necessarily that flexible. So especially for the activities that take place on Connect, they can lock at that time. Again, there's some behind the magic that I can do to unlock them, but it might take a longer time and it might not be always for guaranteed. So please try to get those in. This first week, we have 5 pieces of activity. Normally, it's going to be about 3 pieces. There's always going to be quiz, practice, anatomy, and lab. So I've thrown in 2 extras because we're combining what we would do on the fall semester as 2 weeks. We do it all in 1 week on this particular course, since the spring break takes away a week from us. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and I'm going to jump into yet another place that I want to share with you. And at this point, I'm sharing with you your course on Canvas, or if it's not your course, it is going to be a course of one of your peers, another class, but the layout is very much the similar. So a couple of things that I wanted to show from there. So I assume that most of you are very familiar with using Canvas, but for anyone who's not, the link to these live online sessions, as I mentioned, is in the calendar that's on the left-hand side bar there. And I've got that listed a few different times, these meetings, because these meetings are shown for different classes. So you will only see it listed once. But when you see that that meeting listed there, you can just simply click there, and there's either an automatic link to these meetings, or then there's all the steps that you need to be able to access it, including passwords, including meeting numbers, and so on. So that's the first thing that I wanted to talk about. The second thing that I wanted to show is that once you go to the modules of your course, and you will see a little extra stuff on my version of the screen, we'll just ignore it. I'm not going to go to the student view, which would be what you see, just because there's a couple of things that I do want to keep open here. You'll notice that the week 1 is divided in 2 different modules. The first week 1 is the introduction material, and the 2 activities that I asked you to do there are the syllabus quiz under the introductory assignments and the icebreaker. So please try to get both of those done. Like I said, syllabus quiz carries a little points towards your final grade. That's that many points less that you need to get in an exam. And icebreaker really makes sure that we're all gonna know each other, since we're gonna be working together this semester. In terms of, if you scroll further down, you will see second week 1. So week 1 is listed twice, and this one is labeled as endocrine. So it's all about the endocrine system. And within there, again, I have a bunch of material for you that might help you as you study through that. I have study guides. I provided some recorded YouTube videos going through the same material that we went in the class. I have the handout that we completed in the class, and I also have a completed version of that handout. So we completed it together in a class. And if you missed anything, this version now allows you to check anything that you might have missed while we were reviewing it. So it shows you all of those labeling that we did, all of the important hormones per each endocrine organ that we had a look. And this looks a little different depending on which class of mine you attended, because we completed it in class for each each group, so it varies a little bit what we ended up writing there, but the big gist is the same. And like I said, this might be a very useful handout to keep around when you take your exam and when you are allowed to use notes for that exam. So that's why we took the time to build it together. So you should have that if you attended to the lecture with me. If you didn't attend to the lecture with me yesterday, watch the videos and collect that information from there. Or join me on evening session. If you didn't get a chance to do that, I will then go through it step by step with you. There's some extra material that I provided. Some students of mine in one group were very interested about dissecting a brain to see some of those structures that we looked at, especially the pineal gland. So I've listed that there, and I have some microscopy, some models that have been labeled that might be helpful. I received a couple of questions asking that do I provide the slides that I used in the classroom. So the slides that I used in the classroom, you can see in those videos that I've recorded for you. I don't upload the slides themselves. I upload the slides that are from your textbook. So it's very, very similar stuff. Very, very much the similar structure, just slightly different layout. This is the official stuff that I'm kind of free to hand out. I don't really hand out the versions that I've edited myself, but it's the same material covered in these. And these should be always available there to you on your Canvas course. Some students prefer to print them and use them. You don't have to. Some prefer to take them to the class. It's up to you, whatever works. But the reason why I was on this view to show this second week 1 module is that I wanted to get to the endocrine system assignments. So here's the 3 other assignments in addition to the syllabus quiz and the icebreaker discussion board activity that I showed you before. So at the end of the module, you find the link to your quiz, you find the link to your practice anatomy for the endocrine system, and you find a link to the endocrine disruptors lab activity. So you click on the lab and you can upload your answers there. And remember, it could be a PDF, it could be a picture file if you took a picture of the form that you completed in the class, or if it is a document that you filled in yourself on a computer, it can be that. It can be any form that I can open at my end. And if I can't open it, you'll hear from me. And then, like I said, the quiz and the practice anatomy, they are completed in the Connect. So once you are all set up, it will automatically, once you click on that, take you to the Connect, the publisher's learning environment. And you'll be able to complete these assignments there. So I guess that those were probably the most important things that I wanted to share with you today. And what I'm going to do next, I'm going to open another screen, if you bear with me for a second. And during the class, one thing that we really didn't spend time was on talking about the whole study techniques and all that. I said, and I think we discussed in the class, that many of you probably know already how to study, how to do your thing. So we didn't go into too much of a detail of that. But I promise that if someone's super interested about that, I do offer that information as well during this kind of an introductory session in a virtual setting. So today. So what I'll do next, I'll go through that. And some of the things that I handed out in the class relating to that included this learning styles inventory. So it's a bunch of questions that allows you to figure out, are you a visual, auditory, or kinesthetic learner? And you answer yes or no to questions, and then you do some scoring, and you end up with your learning style. I also gave out a handout where it tells some tips and techniques depending on what your learning style is based on that quiz. So what might be useful for you to do? So if you were in a class, you should have those resources. If you didn't attend to in-person class, I will have these resources available to you to pick up from me at the next class. So that's one option that you get. But like I said, I want to spend a little bit of time just for the sake of completedness to offer a quick run through how to study anatomy and physiology and how to tackle the clinical cases, because it's the clinical cases that we will be doing largely on this semester on BIO202 as lab activities, if it is not a lab activity that's very hands-on. If it's more of a dry lab, such as the one that you completed this time around, often they end up being these clinical cases, and there is a technique how to solve them. So let's have a look of this together. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about learning styles in general, a little bit of time talking about study skills, and we might wander off to talk about exam taking, or I might leave that for once we get closer to the exam. I'll see how we go with the time. And like I said, then I'll at the very end move on to the case studies, how to approach them. But one thing that we notice is that there's really quite a lot of different ways of classifying what type of a learner you might be. One thing that's very obvious from research and that leaders in the field agree, that classifying is really done based on the individual's approach to learn. So really exploring what works for you as a learner is the key to finding out what kind of techniques you want to capitalize on. And on the other side, other hand, if there are techniques that you don't use yet that might bring in some value added to your study. I would go and argue that no one is simply one single style of learning. We're all kind of a combination of different styles, and learning is really never a one-size-fits-all process. So you will have elements from this learning style, elements from another learning style, and really do the pick and mix what works for you. I also would encourage you to try things that might not be natural to you. If I find that I'm heavily one type of a learner and not another type, probably pushing into that other type and using some of those techniques might allow me to do better than what I would normally do if I stay within my comfort zone. So that's just a little thing that I at least encourage you to consider. Well, when we talk about these learning types, like I said, there's many different classification methods. There's many different ways of approaching those. One way to look at them rather than listing this large list is to divide learning into two big groups. We can consider that there are sensing learners and there are global learners. So what does that mean? Let's have a look of that a little together. So the first one, sensing learners, which I have kind of tried to illustrate with this picture of a kind of a close-up of a leaf structure, of a plant leaf. These sensing learners are typically described as being very analytical and liking to learn facts, preferring details and memorizing things. So like you can see on this detailed view of a plant leaf. Really, a hands-on work is where sensing learners excel. So if I try to think of that, how would this relate to anatomy and physiology, well, I think that sensing learners would in A&P prefer to learn different parts on their own. Let's start with one part and then move on to the different. So let's start first by learning bones of a structure. Then let's learn muscles of that structure. And then at the end, once they have learned all these different parts, going to putting all these details together. So it really is building knowledge from details. And as we discussed in the class, your A&P course, like most A&P courses here in America, are structured on a systems approach. So we go one system by one system by one system, and then at the end, all of these systems come together and it all makes sense how human body works, because none of those systems exists or works by themselves. So that would be very much how sensing learners would prefer to learn. There might be, for sensing learners, and I'm not saying that this is definitely the case, but there might be a little bit of a struggle if someone who's strongly a sensing learner is being asked to think outside the box. So sensing learners typically prefer a well-established method and following that method that they are familiar with. So that's the first learning type and a large learning type group that we had a look at. The second group was our global learners. And you'll notice I've taken a picture of the Earth as a planet. So one way to approach biology is really a global approach, systems biology approach, where we consider everything on Earth as one. And you can't understand any of that if you don't understand everything, how it all fits to the bigger picture. So some biologists swear by that you really need to approach biology rather than looking individual cells and so on, looking at big picture. So it's really people who are global learners prefer to start with the concept, the big picture, and then add details later on, once they've grabbed that big concept. And what we end up finding from research is that global learners are really quick problem solvers, so they can get to the result quite easily. But global learners sometimes might struggle with explaining how they got to that result. So it's just something that comes to them. Again, if I think of the A&P, anatomy and physiology classes, and how would a global learner approach that, I guess that global learner would like to start with the general idea of the body and how it fits together, and then only later on to go to fill in the details. So two very different approaches. Knowing which one you are might help you on how to approach each chapter. So I definitely see on myself elements of both. And one thing that I handed out to you in the class is the kind of what I put together, collecting the table of contents from your textbook of all of the material that we will cover this semester. And I'm just looking, I think I have the table of contents here. So if you find yourself as a learner who would benefit from using this, this might be one tool that you use. Personally, that's how I study. So I have an idea of what I will cover, and then I start breaking it into smaller and smaller elements. And these subheadings are for me really more for revising for an exam. One way that people prefer to use table of contents is that, can you explain, can you summarize what was discussed under that subheading? And you can do it verbally, or you can write just bullet point notes next to each subheading. And if you can explain something, you probably understand it. So a lot of the time, what happens to us that we think that we really have grasped a concept and we totally get it. And then comes time to take a test or complete a quiz or do homework. And we're like, oh, I don't really know how to do this. You thought you knew, but you kind of get stuck. So one thing that research has shown, and I full-heartedly believe in, is that if you can teach something, you probably understand it to the level that you really get it. It's easy to think that you understand something and then be like, oh, I quite didn't grasp that. So if you have a friend who's willing to listen to you, family member who's willing to listen to you, or just an imaginary friend, you can try to teach the concepts that we study on this course. And that's the best exercise you can do for preparing for the tests. So really, take a moment to consider which type of these two learning styles, sensing or global, you are, things that you can do that helps you. And like I said, I see elements of both for myself, and I really encourage you to find what works for you. The table of contents is definitely what I lean on when I study new things. It kind of works for me as a check sheet. Can I expand on all of those subheadings? So starting with the big picture, the chapters that we will cover, going to the from the chapters, or even starting with the units that we will study, then going to the chapters, going to the subheadings, and adding kind of more detail as we go. So that's a little bit about general what type of learners we have, but there's much more and other ways to learn and other ways of being. One thing that we often see is that learners can be also described as being either visual learners or verbal learners. And this would be the time when I ask you to look into your notes. Have a look in your notes. When you look at your notes, do you think that you have a lot of highlights, a lot of underlining, different colors, maybe little sketches, diagrams, arrows, boxes? If that's the case, you're probably more of a visual learner. If you have written out sentences or bullet points, or you're kind of spending more time verbalizing the content that you're trying to take notes of, you might be more of a verbal learner. And I would have to argue that our school system is highly verbal. So we really support those students who are auditory learners, and we do a lot of reading of textbook. Do we support enough of the visual learners? That's a question. And as you'll notice in my classes, I try to offer something for everyone. It's not to say that I always succeed, but I'm very aware of different learning styles and try to offer it. So I guess one way to consider this would be if we consider that visual learners, like I mentioned, using highlighters, colors, diagrams, symbols. If you see yourself doing that, you're probably doing pretty good. I'm not a strong textual learner, strong verbal learner myself. So I sometimes struggle with that. And knowing that I struggle with that helps me to take the textual, take the verbal information, try to make it visual for myself. You might be the other way. So let's have a look of an example of a textual description in terms of what might help that individual might get out of this statement. So the textual description of a curved line with every point being equal distance from the center means absolutely nothing. For someone that can completely explain what they're expecting to see. As a visual learner, if I draw a circle, that makes much more sense. So it's up to you, whatever is your learning style. So far we have had a look of our sensing learners, global learners, visual learners, and verbal learners. we can go a little further and we can take another two-folded division of learning styles. So we can talk about individuals that are linear learners. So what I put here is like a picture of steps that one climbs up. So it proceeds in a very linear manner, that to move onwards on these steps, you go from one step to another to another. You rarely end up stepping back and forth, back and forth. You wouldn't be really making that progress. That's just a visual representation of linear learners. And linear learners prefer to go through material in a clear order from start to finish. So we kind of go in a predictable, usually chronological structure is what helps the ease of following for linear learners. And again, thinking of A and P, I think the systems approach forms kind of a nice linear learning pattern for many students who prefer this learning style. But of course, this is not the only way to learn. We also have non-linear learners. And this picture where I just have random shapes, random structures, random pieces of information refers to the learning style where one prefers to receive these what might initially seem random, but let's use rather term individual pieces of information, and then as an individual works through them, putting them together. And it all just comes together when this kind of a non-linear learner has finished studying some. So it might initially seem a little fragmented, but it all comes together. And again, thinking of anatomy and physiology, I think the regional approach, which is how I shared with you in the class that I was trained with, kind of aligns with that non-linear learning style, that we took a certain part of the body and learned all the systems in that. For example, shoulder joint, the bone structures, muscles, the movements generated, what muscles are needed to generate that movement, nerve supply there, blood supply there, and maybe drainage of the lymph from there, so lymphatic system, immune system kicking in, and so on and so on. And by having learned different body parts, eventually, at the end of the training, the idea was that it all comes together and we understand the whole body. So that's the other way to consider this learning. Well, what I would typically do at this point in a classroom would be that I would be asking you to take a learning style inventory. So that's that quiz that I had for you, where we look at different learning styles. You answer the statements and you'll probably find out that you might be more visual, more auditory, or more kinesthetic, or you might be a mixture of those. And there are many different learning style inventories around. And remember, the results that you get are only a guide. It's not definite. Try to use it as a tool that helps you rather than, oh, this is how I have to learn now. And there's nothing wrong with pushing yourself a little bit outside the comfort zone. So let's have a look what kind of results you might find. But if you have never completed a learning style inventory, I really encourage you to take a little bit of time at some point when you're bored, you have nothing else going on, and see, does it align? And it might not align with your perception of yourself. And it might be that the learning style inventory is not accurate. Or it might be that there's something that you can explore that's you haven't realized that you can explore. So let's have a look of what kind of results you might get, and based on those results, what you can take away. So let's start with those individuals who are visual learners. It turns out that about 65% of the population falls under being visual learners. These individuals really prefer neat and tidy notes. They're usually excellent at spelling, reading charts, and really fast talkers. If you are a visual learner, some of the things that you can do, I've listed them here. You might benefit from using flashcards or considering processes as animations So if you're a visual learner, YouTube might be your best friend as you're studying A&P. Try to find an animation that explains the physiological process that we're talking about. In terms of the visual learners, if I was a visual learner and I was in a classroom, I would probably focus on the whiteboard or on the PowerPoint presentation. If the words don't resonate so much, what can I get in terms of visual clues from what's being taught? Using the notes as visual clues, you can use various different kinds of symbols. You don't really need to necessarily write out full sentences if you're a visual. It might be more of kind of hieroglyphic notes that you take. Diagrams, different kinds of graphs, charts are probably where you excel and where you can extract a lot of information from. When you're doing reading, consider it as visual cues. So people who are visual learners, they do okay with reading because it's very visual activity. But listening might not be their strongest point. So just then focusing the energy to what works for you. I guess that one thing that I would recommend, especially with anatomy and physiology aspect for visual learners, try to visualize that process that we're studying in your head. So just kind of seeing the mental image of what is happening. So that's our visual learners. Let's have a look for those who are auditory learners. What can we do for you? And it turns out that about 30% of the population falls within the group of auditory learners. And these individuals, the information really comes in through the ears. So these individuals are often good when it involves speeches, presentations, audiobooks. And usually, surprisingly, research has shown they're also good with foreign languages. Auditory learners tend to benefit from using study groups. So things that you can do if you're an auditory learner, again, I've listed them here. You might want to listen what you are supposed to learn. Focus on that. I even have had students who took no notes, closed their eyes, didn't sleep, but listened very carefully during the class. And that's how they took all the information they needed. They didn't worry about taking notes because they knew that they were auditory learners. And that was more beneficial for them to be present listening that information. Reading aloud your own notes might be really good if you're an auditory learner to someone or just by yourself. Making different kinds of rhymes and riddles and songs that you can hum along of, for example, lists of structures. You can make little mnemonics by using that. Some auditory learners have found it useful to record themselves and then listen, or getting someone to read aloud to you. For example, your textbook or study material. So if you recognize yourself as an auditory learner, that's something to consider. I have even had some auditory learners telling me that what they do is that they play along a tape of where they have recorded themselves reading their notes while they're asleep. I don't know, that sounds a little dodgy to me, but I'm not a highly auditory learner, so I don't know. But definitely, we all spend a lot of time in cars. So listening something while you're driving that's educational might be useful. Try to find recordings of lecture material that relates to what you're learning and spend the time by extracting information from that. So that was our visual and auditory learners. There's one group that often doesn't get quite enough attention, and these are kinesthetic learners. Research claims that there's only about 5% of population that's purely kinesthetic learners. Based on research, these are often males, and they prefer hands-on experiences. So not looking or listening, but actually doing stuff. And that's how they learn. I do think that many of us have some kinesthetic tendencies as learners. So I'll leave it to you to find out what you think you. So these are just what studies suggest. I'm not necessarily locking into that. It turns out that a lot of athletes, a lot of musicians are very kinesthetic learners. They're drawn to things like construction projects, science experiments, and field trips. So again, I try to make sure that in our classes, we spend at least a little bit time doing all of those as well. So what do you do if you're a kinesthetic learner? Some of the things that might help you is to make what you need to learn a process. So it's not really the drawing the chart, having the chart drawn, that's the thing, but it's the process of drawing it that's gonna teach you. So the process of producing the knowledge. Writing out things multiple times might be useful for kinesthetic learners. That's all to do with the idea that you have that process. It's not really the final notes that matter, but how you got to those notes that might help you to learn the content. Imaging, thinking of things, what it might look like, imagine it, or acting out what's happened. What you're studying. Those might be things that might be useful for you. Some kinesthetic learners really benefit from tinkering something as they are studying. So whether it's a fidget spinner or something else, that might be something that you look into as well. So I would imagine that playing around with calculator or math equation or taking apart and putting things together might be things that would fall into there. So I guess that the question is then, which kind of a learner are you based on your learning style inventory? And once you find that out, capitalize what you're strong on, but also develop those areas of learning styles that you are underutilizing. You want to utilize all the tools and all the techniques to succeed that you can to do as well as you possibly can. So that's our learning style inventories. And the next thing that we have that I wanted to talk a little bit is going to be about those study skills. How to tackle the course material and how to take notes. I'm sure most of you are familiar with different kinds of note-taking methods, so we won't spend too long on that. But in terms of how to tackle the course material when you're studying anatomy and physiology, really knowing the terminology will be so important. So your textbook will actually have a vocabulary at the end of each chapter, and that might be super useful. Often in this textbook, new terms are bolded. So when you see a bolded new term, you know that that's an important one, and you want to make sure you understand what it means. And now the virtual electronic version of your textbook is even better because you can just click on something and it opens that vocabulary for that. The other thing that I think is worthwhile to consider if you're studying A&P and you want to excel is focusing on what are the learning outcomes, what you should get out of each chapter. And our textbook again lists those learning outcomes, and you'll find that I've also listed them on Canvas for you. What you should take away from each chapter. So when you know what you're supposed to learn, you can go and learn it, and you know where to focus your energy. And I think that these number 1 and number 2, starting with knowing the terms and starting with knowing what you're supposed to learn, is really the 2 first important steps because they help you to connect the new information that you will be studying. Remember, you're not already studying it. You're just focusing on the terminology and what you're supposed to learn. You're not really digging into the material. Doing those 2 steps helps you to connect what you are, the information to what you already know. So you might find it useful to reflect before you start to study something new. What do I already know about this topic? What are you interested in about this topic? And how does it relate to you or people that you know? So trying to make it somehow important for you. And that's a skill, but that's a skill that you become better and better. If it matters to me, I normally remember it better. So do you know someone with a condition that relates to the topic that we're discussing? Do you know someone who had an injury? Do you already know a little bit about that topic? Is there something that you're really interested in? And only then, now notice this is the only fourth step out of 5 steps. You dig in and study the material. So a lot of students who have not gotten a really good grasp of their learning styles just jump right into the study and feel like, oh my God, that was a lot to go through. But if you break those 3 steps before that and do those, that will make it easier for you by the time you get to the stage where you're supposed to study. And I guess the most important thing is repetition, repetition, repetition when it comes to reviewing what you have just learned. Research says that we should review immediately after we have learned something, then 24 hours after we have learned that, and again a week from when you have learned that. So that repetition of strengthening those memories that you have developed about that topic that you just learned about. Some students might have found it useful, and I do this a lot myself, writing potential exam questions as you study and then testing yourself. Can I answer to that question? So you're kind of predicting what you might get quizzed about. So again, if we were on a face-to-face class, this would be the time that I would direct you to discuss with your neighbor. Do you do some of these, or do they sound hoo-ha to you, or what thoughts does it trigger in you? Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about note-taking. And again, this is a good chance for you to pause and take a look at your notes and compare them with if you have a neighbor sitting next to you. So what do you see when you look at your notes? What makes sense to you? What doesn't? If you have someone else's notes that you can look at, what of that looks really good and useful for you? And is there something that you're like, I don't get why you're doing notes like that? Having that kind of comparison to what you do and what someone else does is always super useful. So let's have a look of 2 different note-taking methods. And there are only 2 out of many, many, many methods, but I just wanted to show some ideas if you have not heard about these yet. And the first one that we're going to discuss is a method described as Cornell Method that was developed in 1940s by Walter Punk, professor of education. And in this approach, entire lecture or entire chapter is summarized on a single piece of paper. So this paper is divided in 2 different sections, and each section serves an important purpose. But the goal is that everything is on one sheet at the end of it. So let's have a look of how this would work. And we're going to start with this note-taking column. It's about twice the size of the left side column. So it's the largest part of this page. And it usually takes the place on the right-hand side of the page. This is what you would be filling in the class, the notes that you take. And again, notice it's not going to be everything. It's mainly going to be just the main points, bullet points, diagrams, graphs, abbreviations being used generously, paraphrasing things, putting them in your own words, writing outlines. And remember to leave space between topics as you're taking these notes. So this is really the business end where the information lives. Then you have a second space, which is smaller on the left-hand side of the page. And this is where you write things such as questions or keywords of what you just took notes of. So these are really the cues, exam questions, names, main ideas, vocabulary terms. And this is what you would typically complete after the class. So whereas the note-taking column was taken during the class and contained a lot more information, you kind of summarize that and pick out the retrieval clues from that under this questions and keywords column. This is what you will use, this column, for your review and study of the material. So that alone should be enough to guide you there. Then you can go to the note-taking column if you need further clarification of something that you have on this questions and keywords column. In addition, at the bottom of the page, we have an area that you complete after the class again. For summary, it's a very, very, very brief written summary of what was covered. The main points from the notes-taking column. So you use it to find the information later, so you don't have to scan through all of that note-taking column. You can really focus on just that summary. And finally, you include the key identification details, such as the name, date, and topic that you had a look at the very top of the page. So that's one method. And a lot of people prefer Cornell Method. For some people it works, some people it don't. You make your own call. Let's have a look of another method that I believe that you're more familiar with, so I won't spend too much time on that, and that's known as the mind mapping. So mind mapping has been used since 90s. It's very visual, very hierarchical. So it shows these relationships between concepts, how they relate to each other. It starts from the center, and then the major ideas are listed right next to the center around it. And each of these major ideas can be expanded upon on other information. So you might find that mind mapping works for you. You might find that it doesn't work. I kind of have a love-hate relationship with it. I like things very structured, and I find it a little too messy for me, but that's just me. So having discussed those, I think that we're in a pretty good spot. Again, I always encourage any questions, even if you're attending remotely later on, watching a recording, nothing prevents you from messaging to me. Like I said, Canvas is usually the quickest place to get an answer from me, so don't hesitate to drop me a message. And what I wanted to do to wrap up this session is just simply quickly touch upon clinical case studies, how to approach those as part of this course, but in general when you're studying anatomy and physiology. So clinical case studies are really your chance to play a doctor a little bit. They are very common in medicine, education of medicine. We love using things such as problem-based learning. So it's all about you looking at the data and coming up with conclusions that are backed up by evidence. So when I review and grade students' case study work, I'm not even as worried about did they get it right. I'm worried about the process. Are these students demonstrating that they are looking at data? Are they extracting information that might be important from that data? And are they using that information to come up with their conclusions? So I'm really looking evidence of a process that makes sense. Not just that you looked at something and you jump to the conclusion. I want you to go through that process of looking at the bigger piece of information, extracting what's important from that, from what you've extracted, then starting to formulate what it might tell you about, and from what it might tell you about, coming to the conclusions. So it really is a process. And in this process, you usually are presented with some sort of a background or some kind of a problem that you're being asked to look at. You might be given or you might be asked to explore plausible explanations. So there might be many explanations to what you're seeing. And then from those many explanations that you generated, we're asking you to come up with the most likely explanation, and most importantly, supporting evidence for that most likely explanation. Why did you say that this is the most likely explanation? What is the evidence that led you into coming up with that conclusion? And I have an example in just a bit, but really, like I said, key things to excel in case study approach is that take the time to go through all of the material that you're being presented. Don't just jump the gun and declare that I know what's the case and what's going on with this patient. Really examine all of the data that you're being provided and try to extract those relevant notes from there. Usually you want to identify what is the key problem on that. And you really want to focus your analysis on a manageable number of problems. Somewhere between 2 to 5 is usually a good place to start. What is important to you and how will they impact what you're looking at? You might end up uncovering possible causes, solutions, so you might have to refer back to your course readings. Usually if we give you a case study, it's related to something that you've been studying. You might engage into discussions with your peers. I'm all about in my class of a teamwork, so nothing would be upsetting about that to me if you say that, oh, we're working on a case study. I'm going to chat with my neighbor in a classroom and hear what they're thinking, what they are deriving as the key problems. You might have to do some outside research. That's one thing that students sometimes get shocked when they move further in their studies. Not every answer and everything that you need is always presented right in front of you. You might have to do some additional work to find the answers that you need. Utilizing your own experience is so valuable. I really encourage, if you have experience on the field, share it, discuss it, bounce ideas. Or if you know someone who has experience, ask from them. And finally, you come with the most likely cause or best possible solution for that case scenario that you were presented. And remember, you don't just jump into that, you back it up with supporting evidence. You might have supporting evidence in favor of what you decided, but also against it. And that would show a very high level of thinking that, hey, I think it's this, but it might be that it's not this because of this. So again, it's all about showing your thought process that we're looking for in case studies. Here's the example of a case study that I picked here. So we have a little paragraph of a patient who develops sudden sweating and dizziness within minutes after the flu vaccine has been administered. He tells you that he is allergic to eggs and is having a reaction. His heart rate is 38 beats per minute and his blood pressure is 86/52 milligrams of mercury. So now really, if you were to start to tackle this, what you would want to do is go through that paragraph and pick what is important on it. What's valuable information? What are the most important things that you tell you that there's a concern? What can all those pieces of information help you? So again, if we were in a class, I would take a moment to do that. We're not in a class, so I'm just going to move ahead and show you some of the important things you might notice from that. It is a sudden change. There was something that changed that's not normal state. This person was given a flu vaccine. He also tells you that he's allergic. That might be a useful piece of information. We know that a normal heart rate should be between 60 and 100 beats per minute. So this is a really low heart rate that we have here. Blood pressure, typically 120/80. Now we're getting 86/52. Is that something we might want to consider? Those are the ways how you approach a case study. And again, that brings me to the end of everything I wanted to share with you today. If you have any questions, again, never hesitate to contact me even afterwards if you're joining me in a remote format watching this recording. I think that about completes everything that I had planned for us for today. And it really is kind of bringing us to a close of our session today. I strongly encourage you to use the material that I have shared on the Canvas to help you in terms of identifying if there's anything that you feel uncomfortable or unclear. Like I said in a class, I think endocrine system is one of the toughest systems to cover because you really don't have all the information to fully understand how each hormone works. And we will come back to those hormones and especially to that handout that we did together. I'm just looking for it. To that handout that we did together as we come back to other systems, because this handout is now just a guide for you of all the important things. It's kind of a quick shorthand review tool. But to fully understand each of these, we might want to go through each chapter before we're quite there. So again, don't let this chapter scare you off. This is probably as hard as it gets. I find personally endocrine system a little abstract because you can't really see the hormones. You can see the structures that make them and you can see their effects, but anything in between might be a little bit more theoretical. So once we get to next week and onwards, we're going to move on to things that are very concrete, very tangible, very practical. You'll actually be able to see them with your own eyes. So fear not. If you made it through the first week, you're doing great. Take the time to use that quiz as a way to read the text. It's not just that now you're supposed to know magically all the answers to that quiz. The quiz is a tool for you to really study that text. And take the time to do that practice anatomy because that's what's going to come up, those same questions in your practical that counts towards your final grade. You'll take the practical at the same time as, or same week as you take the exam. So that's all I had prepared for today. As always, my job is to be here to help you. So never hesitate to reach out to me. And if you did not attend to the class, and if you did not message to me here on Canvas, and if you did not attend or plan to attend to one of these online classes, make sure that you reach out to me one way or another. If I hear nothing from you, I have to report to the college that you were absent and they will drop you from this class. I don't want anyone getting dropped if they don't want to be dropped from this class. So really, as long as we make a contact, I know to tell that this student is still actively participating in this class. If we cannot make contact, I unfortunately have to pass that information forward to the college and they will go through the process of just dropping you. So that's all I have for today. I hope you have a very good rest of the day, very good weekend if we don't see again, and I will see you next week again. Thank you. Bye.